All right, well, hello everyone. So we are going to continue here looking at our blood lecture, and in the next couple of video parts and sections, we're going to look at some features of white blood cells, so leukocytes. We're going to look at specific leukocytes, and then when we will then look at platelets briefly, and then we'll conclude by looking at clotting and the clotting process, right, called hemostasis. So when we look at leukocytes, right, we've looked at erythrocytes or red blood cells in previous parts. The leukocytes are our white blood cells, right? So remember that term leuko is referring to white, right? The white cell, white blood cells. So these are part of our immune system, right? We'll do a separate immune system lecture later on. One big thing for our leukocytes has to do with the nucleus, right? So they all have a nucleus. The nucleus is helpful in differentiating between different types of leukocytes. So one thing you can look at is the size of the cell. You can look to see whether or not there's granules. You can look at the shape of the nucleus, size of the nucleus, things like that, right? These are motile and flexible, so they change shape. They travel through blood. They travel through tissues. Some are in the blood, as we'll see. They undergo these processes called diapedesis and chemotaxis. Diapedesis is basically just squeezing through a blood vessel, and we'll see that they squeeze out of a blood vessel in order to go into the tissue to exert their effect, so to phagocytize bacteria or debris or something like that. And then chemotaxis is this idea of its cells releasing, white blood cells releasing chemicals to attract additional cells, right? And so this is helping to recruit cells to a particular infection site, right? So to eliminate that infection, right? And we'll look at 5 different types of leukocytes, right? So these are our different leukocytes. So we have lymphocytes, we have neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes, right? Now you'll notice here that these are divided into what are called granulocytes and agranulocytes, okay? So granulocytes and agranulocytes vary based on whether or not you see granules. Okay, so the term granulocyte tells you that there are visible granules, right? Agranulocyte, that prefix a just means without or not. Okay, so agranulocytes, no granules, right, or smaller granules. So in this case, the way you can remember this is that the granulocytes, they're full of granules. They all end in phil, okay, P-H-I-L. So neutrophil, eosinophil, basophil. So they are filled with granules. That's the way you remember that. Neutrophil, eosinophil, basophil, they are filled with granules, right? Agranulocytes, either no granules or very, very small granules, right? So what we'll see is we'll look at our 5 different types. And again, they vary based on size, shape, appearance of the nucleus, and then of course whether or not they have granules, right? So our first granulocyte is the neutrophil, right? The neutrophil also is referred to as the polymorphonuclear leukocyte. Polymorphonuclear meaning poly meaning many, morpho referring to morphology, so meaning shape, and then nuclear meaning nucleus. So this means many shapes to the nucleus. So this is a leukocyte that has many shapes to the nucleus, right? And this is what you see here, very lobed, right? Very undulated, lots of lobes to the nucleus. So multi-lobed, very common. This is the most common of all of our white blood cells. And these are involved in phagocytosis, which is this process of cellular eating, cellularly engulfing some other substance. So cell debris, bacteria, some other type of pathogen, right? That's what neutrophils are doing. Okay, their primary stimulus to increase in number and to proliferate is a bacterial infection, right? And so you may, in a clinical setting, you may, hear something about, the white count is up or the white blood cell count is elevated. It could be neutrophils, right, indicating an infection, right? So here you see that white blood cell here. Eosinophils are the second type of granulocyte. Eosinophils are relatively, or at least relative to neutrophils, much less abundant. They're the second least common white blood cell as a whole. In terms of identification, these have a bilobe nucleus, and their granules in the cytoplasm typically stain a red color, usually similar in color to the red blood cell. Right. So if you look here, you can see a multi-lobe nucleus. So here's one lobe, here's another. Here are all of these red granules, and they're similar in color to the adjacent red blood cells. Okay. These are involved in several things, or they increase the number in several things. One is allergies. One is asthma. And the other main one are parasitic worm infections. So parasitic infections. So you may hear, there's something referred to as eosinophilic asthma, and so there's a commercial that you see on TV every so often, or at least currently there is, and it's talking about eosinophilic asthma and medications for it. And one of the warnings, or not one of the warnings, but one of the things it says is to inform your doctor, inform your provider on whether or not you've recently had a parasitic infection. Right. And so that's because those eosinophils that could be kind of implicated in that eosinophilic asthma could also be elevated because there's a parasitic worm infection. Right. So informing your provider of a recent parasitic infection is necessary in those types of conversations. Right. And then the last type of granulocyte is what's called a basophil. Basophils are the least common of all white blood cells. Granulocytes and agranulocytes combined, they're the least common, right? These typically have a bilobe nucleus. Often the nucleus is somewhat obscured, somewhat kind of hidden by these dark staining granules. So you can see here these really dark, large granules in the cytoplasm. They're covering the, or kind of occluding and covering the surface of the nucleus, so it's somewhat hard to see, right? And in those granules, you've got histamine and heparin. Histamine is a vasodilator. It helps with capillary permeability, and so this allows, or it contributes to symptoms associated with allergy. So again, you may take a medication like an antihistamine, right? The antihistamine is blocking the receptors for histamine that's released from these granules in the basophil, right? And then heparin is also released. Heparin is an anticoagulant. And so again, in the context of things like infections, preventing blood clotting allows blood to continue to travel to the site of the infection, and heparin is aiding in that process. Okay, so those are our granulocytes. If we take a second and look at our agranulocytes, we'll see a couple. So one is the monocyte, right? Monocytes are kind of in terms of the least abundant to most abundant, they're somewhere in the middle. These typically have a C-shaped, sometimes you may see it referred to as a kidney bean shaped or horseshoe shaped nucleus, right? So you can see a kind of a good example of this one right here, kind of that C-shaped nucleus, right? These will leave the vascular system and go to the tissues and take up residence in the tissues, as you can see. And when they do that, they often change their name from monocyte to macrophage, right? And again, phagocyte, you can see the ending here, phage, phagocytize. These are cells that undergo or use the process of phagocytosis. They are phagocytic cells, right? So they cellularly engulf and bring in other bacteria, other pathogens, right? So that term phagocytosis is essentially cellular eating, right? And that's what you have these white blood cells doing, right? And then the last main cell type, or white blood cell type, specifically agranulocytes, is the lymphocyte, right? So lymphocytes are the second most common, right behind neutrophils. These are typically about the same size, maybe slightly larger than red blood cells, and their nucleus is typically taking up the majority of the cytoplasm. Okay, so again, if you look back at some of these previous ones, you can see all of this kind of space behind the nucleus and beside the nucleus. That's all cytoplasm, right? So you can kind of see some of it here. You can see some of it here with the eosinophil and here as well. For lymphocytes, the nucleus takes up a majority of the inside of the cell, right? So it's a dark staining round nucleus, right? And then you have different types of lymphocytes. The two primary ones that we'll discuss in this course, and we'll get to it later in a later lecture, are T cells and B cells, right? T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. T lymphocytes, the T stands for the thymus, so the little gland that sits kind of on the ventral surface of the heart. And this is where the T cells go to mature. So they're made in the red bone marrow, and they go to the thymus to mature. B cells, think of this as standing for the bone marrow, right? Bone marrow. And so these are made in the red bone marrow, and they stay in the red bone marrow to mature, right? And then lastly, you have NK or natural killer cells, and these act to target abnormal cells, infected cells, things like tumor cells as well. These natural killer cells can act and eliminate those bad and or abnormal infected cells. So if we look at a few things related to leukocytes, we're just going to focus on these here. So just kind of a high-level overview. There are terms given to conditions in which you have elevated or reduced white blood cell counts, right? So the term leukopenia means reduced, okay, or this term penia, when you see that penia, that kind of means reduced, right? So osteopenia or sarcopenia, that means like a loss of bone, loss of muscle. Leukopenia is a reduced number of white blood cells, right? In general, we're just referring to leukocytes, not a specific type, but just in general, right? And so you can imagine if you have a decreased number of leukocytes, that's going to increase your risk for infection, right? Likewise, you have one that increases or refers to an increased leukocyte count, and that's cytosis. So this ending cytosis is meaning an elevated count. And in this case, this one may increase your risk of infection. This one may indicate an infection, right? So it may be caused by a recent infection, possibly stress, but we'll talk about it in the context of infection, right? So, so seeing a elevated white blood cell count on a kind of a complete blood count panel in a clinical setting could tell you that your patient is having an acute infection, right? And then you can look at it, what's called a differential. And so differential simply is looking at the different types of white blood cells and seeing if or which of those is elevated, right? Is elevated. And again, this can be useful for clinical diagnoses. So again, if you have an elevated neutrophil count versus an elevated eosinophil count versus an elevated monocyte count, this is going to maybe clue the healthcare team in to something more specific that may be going on other than just elevated white blood cell count, right? So that's a little something to think about, right? So we're going to stop there, and then we will pick up in our next part, and we'll begin talking about we'll talk briefly about platelets, and then when we will then get into talking about something known as clotting, and we'll talk about the process called hemostasis.